Hello and welcome to Inclusion Dialogue, a podcast where we discuss everything related to inclusive education and diversity in the classroom. My name is Joanne Banks and I'm a lecturer in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Education. This podcast consists of interviews between me and leading academics from all over the world where we discuss how we define inclusive and special education. We look at the difference between theory and practice and what inclusion looks like on the ground in our schools. I began this project for my students, and it was to allow them to hear the views of researchers that I was getting them to read in the form of journal articles and research reports. I've been pretty overwhelmed by the response though, and I think as the podcast has grown, it will be of a much broader appeal to other academics, to policymakers, to educators and practitioners, to parents, but also to students themselves. My guest this week is Professor Brahm Norwich, who is Professor of Educational Psychology and Special Educational Needs at the Graduate School of Education in the University of Exeter. In our discussions, we examine the development of inclusive education looking at the UK context. Brahm describes the changing patterns of provision there over time and the role of local authorities in resource allocation. We also examine the tensions in the ongoing debates around inclusive education, both in the UK and beyond, and also where special education fits within that.
Good morning, Brahm, and thank you so much for meeting with me this morning. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me about the key issues in inclusive education in the world today. Do you mind if I maybe start the interview by asking you how you got into the field of inclusive education originally?
Yeah, sure. I come to it from my professional background as a practitioner educational psychologist. I studied psychology and philosophy as an undergraduate. I was interested in postgraduate work, and I did a doctorate in educational psychology. I taught. In fact, I taught while I was doing my doctorate, and then I became a practitioner psychologist, and then I became very interested in special schools, the placement of children in special schools, because that was a big part of my job. It was always an issue. I was also very interested in an organisation in Britain called the Independent Panel of Special Education Advisors. I was involved in the beginning of that and acted as a professional advisor to parents who weren't happy. So I've had quite a bit of experience of that. And I then went to work at the Institute of Education, London University, where I worked for many years. And I worked with people who were very much involved, particularly Klaus Waddell, who's involved in the field of, in the development of special educational needs, the legislation, the 1981 Act through the 1980s. And then I worked there in the 1980s and 90s. And then I decided I was no longer going to work at London Institute. I wanted to move somewhere else, and I've moved to Exeter, and I've been working here since. So I guess I'm a professor of educational psychology, so I'm somewhat involved in the practitioner psychology training course, and I'm involved in special needs and inclusive education, teaching and research. And I guess inclusive education, I guess when I first started, the talk was integration, and then inclusion became more prominent in the early 90s, and then I became very interested, but I've always had an interest in both and also the problems with both terms. And I guess that's been a sort of current issue in my interest. Yeah.
Your career has really spanned quite a significant amount of change in the UK. For listeners that aren't familiar with it, could you give a kind of an overview of perhaps the changes from the Warnock report and that period in the 1980s, that integration period that you speak of?
Yes. I mean, I came into the career in the 80s at a time that the Warnock Report and the 1981 Act, which is still the dominant framework on which we work. It's never been challenged. And I think, to me, that's a real problem. And basically, it was seen as very progressive. And the whole tenor of talking about special educational needs was supposed to be very learner-centered. It was supposed to be anti-category, anti-deficit model. You wouldn't believe it nowadays, but that was certainly the tenor. That was what we taught. But of course, practice doesn't always keep up with the sort of founding ideals, as we know. So I think that I was involved in I took over a longitudinal study in connection with the Centre for the Studies of Inclusive Education. It was with Mark Vaughan. It was a study that was started in the 1980s, and I became involved in the 90s, and I'm still involved in it now with CSIE. And that's really charted the sort of considerable reduction in the number of children in special schools in the 1980s, and a continued reduction in the 1990s, and then a beginning of a leveling out. And then now we're having an increase. And that's within the English school system. And so I'm not talking about Wales or Scotland. I'm not quite sure about what the figures are there. I think in England there's been a very detailed sort of monitoring, both at governmental level and through this organisation in which I've been involved in that sort of surveying. So I think there was a very strong push. I mean, interestingly, it wasn't under a government that you might initially assume was very pro-inclusion. It was during the Conservative Party governments. And when Labour came into power at 97, I think it was 1997, there was a strong push and certainly an adoption of Salamanca ideas and talk about inclusive education. But I think a lot of it was talk. If you actually looked at the figures, there was a lot of sort of rhetoric about inclusive education, but the dominant policies were really around curriculum assessment, the raising attainment agenda, and so on. And actually, when you look back now, the trends towards the rising number of children in special schools started in the mid-2000s, which was into the Labour period. So I think there's sort of issues that really are not sort of specific to any particular set of governmental policies. I think they might have been initiated by them, but it's difficult to know exactly what goes on. But
Can I ask a little bit about that longitudinal study? Because that's what, in my research, it seems to be quite lacking for how we kind of track the progress of students with special educational needs or disabilities. What did that study find of those students? You mentioned a declining number in special schools. Did you track where those students went?
Well, I mean, this is very basic research. It's sort of research based on what's called administrative data. Okay. So it wasn't cohort data where you actually design the data you're collecting. And of course, it's data that at the time has sort of gone into the National Pupil Database, which is a much more significant activity of data collection. It was really focused on local authorities and looking at the 150 or so local authorities that make up England, and looking at the variation in the proportions of children in special schools. And I think that was certainly the CSIE, which is an advocacy group, and I was involved, and I've been working with my colleague Alison Black, and others, and we've been sort of involved in it now for quite a few years in its sort of new form, because in fact the database had to change, which is really to do with what data was available through the British database. But it's the trend lines that count, and so simply what we were looking at were children who reside within a local authority area, say take Hertfordshire in southeast of England, and those children that are Hertfordshire children, in other words, that the local authority is responsible for, what proportion go to special schools. Now, some of them might go to special schools in Buckinghamshire or in Barnet, which are adjoining sort of local authorities. They would still be counted as Hertfordshire. So there's quite a lot of statistical, what we call imports, exports you have to deal with. And of course, Hertfordshire would run its own special schools, and therefore if Buckinghamshire children came in, so that there was that. So the kind of data we dealt with was a somewhat more refined version of what the government releases every year, because the government releases its own figures every year as well. And so I think the interesting thing is, and I'm not sure that we really know, is what was going on in the 2000s and then beginning 2007, when you begin to see the rising trend. And that rising trend has continued. And the latest report took us up to 2017, and the figures just keep going up to 18. And of course, there's been a growth of special schools with the academization process. So there's sort of special free schools that have been set up. And so in a sense, it does mark a sense of what some people call a reversal. And I would certainly see it as a reversal. I mean, it's interesting that those figures were picked up by the UNESCO. There was a UNESCO visitation looking at England's compliance with the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of People with Disability. And they picked up that as evidence that sort of suggested that all was not well with inclusion in special schools. But it's a lot more complicated than that sort of base data shows. I think the other thing the data shows that's of interest, and I think is of considerable interest, is the sort of local authority variation. Now, of course, local authority variation is quite considerable. On the current data, Torquay, which is quite close to where I live now on the south coast, has a fairly small unitary authority, has the highest proportion of children in special schools. And Newham, which is an East London borough, outer London borough, has the lowest, and has been the lowest for many years. And in a sense, Newham is a very interesting example of a sort of policy-led politics, clearly politics-led, policy-led decision to build capacity for support in the ordinary school system. So what you can do is you can chart local authorities that move around and reflect changing local practices.
And how would you explain the difference in two local authorities that are so stark like that? Because we don't have the luxury of that kind of data here in Ireland, but what explains that London?
I think there are, I think there's certainly sort of Europe-wide evidence that there are regional differences in the proportion of children. I think the European agency did work some time ago, Cormeyer, who's now director, did work that showed that where you have high population concentrations, then you had more special schools. Where you had low population densities, you had rather few. And if you follow that line, and that was done by breaking Europe up into regional bases, if you follow that line, you would expect higher proportions in London, lower proportions in more rural areas. Well, Cornwall's always had a very low proportion of children in special schools. And in fact, even before, the main thing about special schools is cost. They're very expensive. And a very expensive part of special schools is transport. So you're spending a lot of money on transporting children from one part to another to go to a special school. It's much more efficient to try and set up special classes or units. And you find this in the United States. I mean, I know I did some work in Pennsylvania. If you go to a city in Maryland, like Baltimore, it has quite a lot of special units and quite a concentration of specialized type schools and so on. You go to sort of rural areas of Maryland, you don't see any special schools. What they do is they set up a sort of systems of specialized classes, which allow a lot more social inclusion than you would if you have people who are really quite distant. So I think the demographics is a big element. I think the other element that is a really big element is the policy, and I think that is shown very clearly in Newham. There is history written. I mean, there are books written about how Newham came to make this decision that it was going to, include a greater number and build up their support. And I've certainly over the years and quite recently heard advisors from Newham discuss how, even despite the academization processes, they've managed to maintain this support in the regular school, and they certainly have maintained. Now, some people characterize Newham as not using or having special schools. Well, you can call a school not a special school and call it by another name. But the question of, is there a separate provision that is specialized in some way? Newham has a couple of special schools. It also, if parents request it, it exports children across into neighbouring authorities. And when you look at Newham's figures, some of them are exports and some of them are not. So I think, Newham is an interesting example of what can be done. I think the other interesting authority, that's a very interesting authority, is Barnsley, because if you track Barnsley over a period of time in Yorkshire, traditionally a Labour-controlled local authority, Barnsley was certainly up there with Newham for some years as having a low proportion of children in special schools. And I know from speaking to people who were inspectors and advisors, they've certainly built up capacity in the ordinary school. But with academization, with the greater development of powers to head teachers, they came under pressure. I think some of the local authority staff who sort of, in a sense, led the development of the regular school, the ordinary school support systems, left. And Newham and Barnsley started building more special schools. Once you build special schools, you fill them. And so Barnsley is no longer one of those authorities. So I think there's more that one can do to actually look at what is going on. I think funding is a very big element as well. I belong to SEN Policy Research Forum, which is a sort of, we run these open policy seminars, and we have a group, and we've been involved in looking at some of the funding issues. And I think there are real issues about how funding is allocated to local authorities. Local authorities currently are experiencing a lot of financial pressures and putting them pressures on the DfE. I think the DfE have been given, Central Department of Education has been giving more funds to local authorities. But I think that the pressure certainly for special school has grown. And I'm not quite sure. We have done some research on that. I'm not quite sure of what's going on. I mean, there's been some anecdotal evidence that academies might be discriminating against children with special needs. I think the evidence of the research we've done fairly recently doesn't support that as regards children with more significant special needs, those who've got EHC plans. But that isn't to say that there aren't swings and roundabouts, because we know there are some academies that try to adopt inclusive practices, and therefore they might be compensating for others that are, in a sense, making it hard for children, particularly at secondary transfer, because I think this is where the anecdotal evidence lies. So that's been an area where I have sort of been doing research. I've been trying to do other research, but one doesn't always get the funding. Good.
I see you've done work on the initial teacher education piece. Could you give us some idea of your views on that and how that's linked to whether inclusive education can happen in a mainstream context?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I mean, to be honest with you, my research sort of runs on two lines. I mean, there's the lines of some of my sort of underlying issues, and much of which is not funded, actually. And those tend to sort of come out in books and more theoretical papers. And then there are things for which I get drawn in because there's funding opportunities, or this looks interesting, or somebody sort of saying. I certainly, during the Labour period, and it's now over 10 years, was certainly involved in what was at the time the Teacher Training Agency developments on trying to improve the pre-service or the initial teacher education. And I mean, we were involved in all sorts of innovations. I was involved in rollout. I mean, this is in the Labour period. A lot of money was spent, so much money that I remember the civil servant asking the civil servant when we were up in Manchester one day giving a regional seminar to initial teacher training providers. Tell me, I'd say, how much money have you spent on all of this? He wouldn't tell me. I mean, it was a considerable sum of money that was being spent. The trouble is it gets lost. And part of the issues also are that the training system has become more diversified. That you have school-based training, you've got schools that do their own training, that are school-centered training. You have places that sort of use the universities to provide the more theory part of the training, and then you have the sort of university courses like the one we run at the graduate school here in Exeter. And I think all that doesn't make for the sort of suggest, if you look at the competencies, it certainly says something is relevant there. But I think part of the problem is how do you prepare teachers to adapt their general teaching? And I think that there are lots of sort of persuasive messages that are sent to people of what they should do. My own view is that I don't think enough is done to actually make the planning of lessons and the resources required and the staffing required to so-called differentiate lessons, to make it a reality. I think the sort of single teacher, whole class model of teaching, the idea that you're going to get inclusion with that sort of model of teaching learning, I think is pie in the sky. I think you can go so far, and I think it's partly to do with the capabilities of the teachers. I've literally 5-10 minutes ago was reviewing a paper, actually, very interesting paper about teaching plans in West Africa, in East African countries. And what they were showing, I can't say very much about it in detail, but what it showed was that they were developing a system of looking at how teachers plan lessons. And this is obviously driven by UNESCO and other inclusive. And by and large, when they examined over 150 or whatever teaching plans in terms of a sort of framework, there was supposed to be something said about children with special needs. All the lessons, which were probably exemplary lessons they're looking at, didn't cover them. We've done research with colleague Hazel Dawson, Alison Black. We did research on looking at teachers who were seen nominated as being good at lesson planning, for inclusive lesson planning is what we called it. And we did some very sort of fine-grained sort of work. And I think that was very interesting. But to translate that into mass institutions of initial teacher education, there are other issues. So I think, of course, it's bound up with the role of teaching assistants and so on. One of the areas I've been involved in for several years, it's sort of in abeyance, again, partly because of not funding and so on, is trying to develop a model of what we call integrated or inclusive group teaching of reading. So trying to introduce a kind of targeted approach to children who were struggling with reading, who had not yet, some of whom had an identified disability or special needs, but others were struggling for other reasons, maybe English was an additional language or whatever. And trying to develop a model of, you could see it as differentiated, based on a group-based model of classroom management, in which there was a very clear role and interplay between what the class teacher did, and there were materials that supported the group, which was basically a temporary group that was being supported with their reading, who would otherwise have been taken out of the class as having reading difficulties, maybe not quite reaching the threshold of a specific literacy difficulties, but certainly some were going to be. So it's an early intervention. And I mean, I don't want to go into all the details. People can read about it or whatever. But I think that is what is required. And I can tell you that involves an enormous development of materials, training, support, group organizations, teachers willing to try on approaches, greater sort of flexibility and so on. And we're just dealing with one small area of early reading. And interestingly, I mean, this is by the way, I mean, but it sort of illustrates how people pigeonhole you. We were trying to get further funding of this through the Education Endowment Foundation, who were doing a special needs call for work on special needs. And we put this through and we thought it was quite good. But they didn't want to fund it because they said it wasn't special needs enough. You know, and I mean, this is sort of notion of trying to develop a more adapted, inclusive, bringing the teaching assistant and the teacher together, having sort of well-developed materials and so on. That just didn't fit the pigeonhole of that's not special needs teaching. Well, my view is that if that's the way you think about it, and that's the way research grants are handed out, you know, it's difficult to operate.
I just give you a little insight into what's going on in Ireland at the moment. We're having a consultation with the National Council for Special Education, and it's been put out the idea of Ireland moving to a full inclusion model. We currently have a growing system of special classes every year, and we have an increased capacity in our special schools as well over the past, you mentioned the mid-2000s, and I'd say that's pretty much a similar time period when things started escalating in terms of numbers and prevalence in mainstream as well. Now, you've mentioned funding, you've mentioned initial teacher education, but what are the key issues do you think that Ireland in this consultation period should take into account in considering moving to a full inclusion model, which would essentially be the New Brunswick model of removal of special classes, schools, change in our language, and I presume a root and branch change in how we fund these students as well?
Well, I spent much of my career arguing against ideological purity, and I will carry on doing so as long as I'm around, because I don't think calling something a full inclusion model is very useful. I think that you know, the notion of full inclusion. I mean, I would always say that any time anyone comes out with a phrase like full inclusion, you know, just be aware of the limits of it. Now, that doesn't say that you don't challenge the limits or work to the limits, but you need to understand why there might be limits or challenges. And I think this is, you know, in a way, I mean, I think Roger Slee once commented to me, or I read a review. I mean, he's I guess somebody who's quite well known internationally, and you know, and he just said to me, "Oh, well, Brahm, he's conservative." You see, yeah. I mean, that gives you the sort of way that this is highly sort of ideological. I mean, at a sort of almost an interpersonal level, and it's not very helpful. I mean, it seems to me that there is that there is a kind of issue of dealing with reality, you know, and I think this is very relevant to our wider political situation we're in, both in the UK, in the USA, in Europe, internationally. The issue of, you know, and I mean, it's very interesting when you hear people debate about inclusion. And I witnessed one a couple of weeks ago, because one of the things we do with our teaching is we run a debate about inclusion, which is very much tied down to that inclusion means the closure of all special schools in the foreseeable future. And I'm about to transcribe that debate because I really think it's very illustrative of how people think. There's a sort of sense of, if you adopt an inclusive framework, that means you don't want to talk about difficulties. Yeah, differences, yes, but you don't want to talk about difficulties. And I think part of the problem is that it's the owning that we all have difficulties, that life is difficult. And that's not a very popular view if you're trying to be very progressive in a way. And I would see myself as progressive. So I think there's a real issue on the progressive wing about being realistic. And I think it shows up all the way through our politics. And you see it in many national debates that are going on in politics. And I think it plays through in education as well. And I do think that is the issue. So I think that when I hear about full inclusion, I think to myself, and are you really including everybody? And, are you taking account of children with quite significant mental health or behavioral challenges? Are you taking account of those? And if you're saying, oh, well, no, we'll come to that, we'll do that. Well, the question is, what are you going to provide for them? So, I think that's one element. I think the other element in the inclusion debate that I think has become much clearer to me, and I see it also with the teachers I work with, that somehow inclusion somehow is seen as a sort of top-down thing that you implement. But is there a democratic mandate for inclusive education that means the closure of all special schools? I have my doubts about that. And I say that in the light of spending many hours having listened to people of all, points of view, which is one of the reasons why I've become very interested in the idea that we need to have we need a much more deliberative, participative, democratic approach to this idea of inclusive education. And some people would argue a continuum of provision. Oh, no, that's old hat. We don't want a continuum of provision because that just justifies special needs and a deficit model, and we believe in a social model. I don't think it's as simple as that. As much as I support elements of a social model, I think there are difficulties that we all experience, and we're all. We all have our disabilities, or have had our disabilities. And I think that the identity that goes with that and the recognition and the sort of interplay of that and adaptation and issues of affordability are really important. So I think, it's not straightforward. So don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not just arguing for the continuation of special schools. I mean, that's clearly not as they are. But the idea that there might be a place for separate settings, maybe on a part-time basis, I certainly, over the last 10 years, there's been at a sort of ground floor level, at a low level, there's been the development of co-located special schools. Some people just see those as staging posts to the full inclusion and therefore the disbandment of all special schools. I think there are, you have to take account of groups of parents, and parents will form associations, and you will find that the professional associations become very politically active in supporting their parents' views. This is a political issue, but the idea that it's just a straightforward, simply resolvable political issue is just not realistic. Yeah. So I mean, my take at the moment is, and I wrote this paper when the 40th anniversary came up that really what we needed is to get away from the kind of party politics, because I think what we have now in Britain is a government. And I mean, even the Select Committee of the House of Commons is saying that we don't have a decent inclusive strategy. There's been all this financial problems around local authorities not being able to afford the growing costs, and a lot of them going into debt in affording special schools. And so I think you could argue that we really need to have a proper sit-down discussion about this, informed by research and a calm state of mind. And no doubt it will involve some compromise and people not getting exactly what they want, for sure. So I mean, that's my sort of current view. I sort of not particularly confident the government can come up with that. I think maybe citizens' assemblies might be a good way of getting some deliberation into the whole field of school education.